Next, we're very excited to have the opportunity to hear from Andrew Opdyke from First Trust Portfolios. Andrew's a senior economist and a member of the First Trust economics team that Bloomberg ranked as one of the top forecasters of the U.S. economy over the past several years. First Trust Portfolios is an asset management firm based in Wheaton, Illinois, with over $200 billion in assets under management. Andrew's research team's been instrumental in guiding the Stenger rebalance process this past decade, including selling long-term bonds and eliminating international equity exposure. Andrew and his team at First Trust published extensive amounts of economic data and research that kept Stenger family office clients invested despite the 2008 and 2009 recession and then the COVID panic of 2020. Andrew earned his BA in economics from Hope College and his MBA from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. He is a chartered financial analyst and a member of the CFA Society of Chicago. So with that, please join me in welcoming Andrew Opdyke.
All right, thank you. Oh, what music? This is exciting for me. First off, good morning. This is exciting. I travel around the country. I take 100 flights a year, visit 100 different cities. I'm East Coast, West Coast, North, South, Canada, Mexico. But this is, out of the 1,000+ talks I've given over recent years, this is the closest I've ever been to home. I grew up about a mile from here, right on the other side of Naperville Center. I remember watching downtown Naperville grow up when we got our first Eddie Bauer, right? Back in 1990. And we were like, we made it. We've got Oswald's Pharmacy, and now we've got Eddie Bauer. So I'm very excited to be here. And we have a lot of things to talk about. There's 3 things I want to cover this morning, 3 major topics that I want to discuss. And they're going to kind of move from the shortest term to the longest term, because there's what everybody pays attention to if you turn on the TV, if you turn on the radio, if you open up the newspaper. So much of the conversation today is about the Fed. Where are we at with inflation? Are they going to raise? Are they going to cut? What does that mean for the U.S. economy? They are dominating the news cycle. Now, let me just remind everybody that the Federal Reserve has had a bit of a tough time forecasting where they themselves would be over recent years. If you remember in 2020, the Fed said, don't worry, inflation's not coming, right? 2021, as the year started, they said, okay, we have inflation, but it's going to be transitory. It's going to be temporary. By the end of the year, we are convinced inflation will be down to 1.7%. That was their target for the end of 2021. As we finished that year, we were at 7.0%. Okay, so to their credit, right, they got one of the numbers right. They knew there'd be a 7 in there somewhere. They had it in the wrong spot. They were off by 5.3%. Now we get to 2022 and they say, okay, we were off in our forecast last year, but now we have a good idea on where inflation's going to be. If we raise rates 3 times, this was their expectation going into last year. If we raise rates 3 times, inflation will come down to 2% by the end of the year. We didn't get 3 rate hikes. We got 17, right? With all their 400+ PhDs, they only missed by 14 rate hikes, okay? And we ended the year with inflation still elevated. So as we sit here today, we'll look at what's still driving inflation. I'll explain why I think it's been so hard for them to forecast and why I think they still have a little bit of work to do. The second thing we'll talk about is if they've got work to do and rates are higher, which means 30-year mortgage rates are higher, the cost to borrow and buy a house, borrow and buy a car, borrow and invest in a business is higher. Are we prepared for that? Are consumers in a position, because we do have corporate debt at all-time record highs. We have individual debt at all-time record highs. Okay, as we look at these pieces, are we prepared as we look out into 2024? What may that look like if rates need to stay higher? That's the second thing we'll look at. But the third thing I want to focus on is the momentum over time. Right? The longer term trends, because when I think about investing, it's very hard to time what's going to happen in the next 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. But what's really important is, do we have the dynamism? Do we have the momentum, the activity here in the United States or internationally to progress us in 3, 5, 10, 15, 20? Okay, so that's the plan for today. We're going to hit on each of those 3 pieces: inflation, are we prepared, and what drives us forward. Okay, so let's start with that inflation picture. And as we start with inflation, in order to understand it, I want you to come back with me to 2020. Come back with me to March and April of 2020. Okay, that time period where, if you remember, we weren't sure if we were allowed to go to the grocery store. right? In 2020, March and April, we weren't sure if Starbucks was even going to be open, right? And during that time period, to remember how unusual it was, that's when we had the great toilet paper run of 2020. Right? We had why did we think we were going to run out of toilet paper and hand sanitizer? We don't know, right? But looking back, there are still people. I was giving a talk in Schaumburg last night, and one of the people said, I'm still working through my stock. And I'm like, that's okay. That's why there was a shortage, right? But you think about that time period and both sides of the equation, whether you were looking at services, whether you were looking at goods, activity over that 2-month time frame, it fell at a pace that we hadn't seen in 100+ years. In fact, we've never really seen a step back in such a short time period before. Now, it wasn't going to last, and we're going to figure out how do we emerge from COVID? How do we progress from here, right? And as we did that, as we moved through 2020, by the end of that year, spending got up and started setting new highs. But what we were doing was different, right? Because what we were allowed to do was different. Can I ask real quickly, show of hands, how many people flew during the second half of 2020? Handful of people. It was kind of awesome, wasn't it? Right? You went to O'Hare, you could park anywhere you wanted. You walked straight through security, you got your own row on the plane, and every plane was taking off on time, right? Because there was roughly as many people flying as there were planes. Now, during that time period, we were down 90%. In 2020, did you go to a professional sporting event? You couldn't. Did you go to a concert? Did you go to the movie theater? How often, did you go and sit in a restaurant? At the end of the year, some of it started to open up, but the service side of the economy, right, they were diminished. So what did we do? Think back to 2020. If you didn't go on vacation that summer, if you didn't travel to go visit family members as we got to this time of the year, where did we spend our cash? In our homes. We had the world come to us. Right? We said, look, we're working from home, and maybe we were sitting there looking at home, and my wife's a teacher, right? All of a sudden, the kids are taking class from home, the teachers are teaching from home, and people start to look around and say, maybe we should work on that fence now. Maybe we should work on the deck. Maybe we should do a little remodeling on the inside of the house. We started to bring the world to us, right? Again, you want to remember, because in the moment, it all made a ton of sense. Now we look back, this is when we had the Peloton craze. And it made sense, right? We can't go to the gym, so let's just have the gym come to us. We said, we're going to buy a Peloton, maybe 2 Pelotons, right? We're going to put them in the basement, and me and my spouse are going to wake up every morning, and we're going to compete against all the neighbors. And when COVID's done, we're going to be the healthiest couple on the block, right? And that lasted for 3 weeks, because that's how long it took us to realize we don't like to cycle, right? But during that time period, the world starts coming to us. So you look at the data, and what you see is that the service side of the economy is still down. The good side of the economy comes roaring back. Now, I was traveling in late 2019, I was traveling up until the very beginning of March that year. Okay, I traveled through January, and the questions we were getting from all over the place is, hey, this thing that we're hearing about, we've got COVID, it's showing up in China, it's showing up in Europe. Could it show up here? Could we see a shutdown? And it was like, well, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. Right? We've never seen something like this before. Did I have a single company? Did you hear, if you work in manufacturing, if you've worked on the good side, if you know people on the good side, did you meet a single person in late 2019, early 2020 that said, man, this COVID thing is going to be huge for my business. So I want to take out some extra money. I want to invest in inventory. I want to hire some extra workers. I want to get some extra equipment. Did you meet a single person leading up to COVID who said, this is going to be great for me? No, right? Even companies like Amazon, and Amazon has more data about what we do than probably any other company in the world. Amazon gets caught flat-footed. And here we are, we're during that time period where activity comes roaring back. And if you turned on the TV during this time period, you heard about the Port of Long Beach. Do you remember the Port of Long Beach? It's the biggest port in the United States, and it was 111 ships waiting offshore, and it took them 11 days to dock and unload. Now, I went out and saw it. It was my first trip when I got back to traveling. I went to Long Beach, and it was a floating city. And there were cameras lined up everywhere. And the Fed said, well, this is what we need to solve. If we get the jobs back and the supply chain eases, inflation will come back down. Inflation will be transferred. This is why you don't need to worry about it. Okay. Now, Amazon is looking at this, and they said, well, we have massive demand. Everybody wants things still brought to us. We wanted the world to come to us because we couldn't go outside. So in 2020 into 2021, they doubled their staffing. They hired hundreds of thousands of workers. They invested $90 billion in transportation and infrastructure in order to be able to fly their own planes over the port of Long Beach or take their own boats to a different port. But if you think about this, as the manufacturing companies, as the Pelotons of the world, the bicycle manufacturers, the Amazons, the UPSs, the Home Depots of the world said, look, we can bring the world to you. They hired extra workers. Where did they get them from? The service side of the economy. They started going and they said, look, the hotels, you don't have the same level of activity. They didn't have the support for all those workers, and some of those workers started to move over. In the restaurants, they started to move over. At the airports, we started to see the shift. Now, Amazon, as I fly in and out, I visit about 45 states every year. I can say 90% of the time, as you are landing at an airport, the single largest building that you will see, other than the airport, is going to be an Amazon distribution facility. There is a huge one over by O'Hare. And they came over to O'Hare and said, do you have any workers? The baggage handlers, is there anybody over here who doesn't have activity? Because we need workers. We will offer them $10 more per hour with full benefits if they'll come over and they'll work with us. And what did people do? They went and they moved. They went to where activity was. They got a pay raise. They got better benefits. They took that opportunity. And for a while, that helped us on the good side, right? It helped bring activity back. It helped move things through the system. But then we had this issue that arose in 2021. And it's a little bit hard to see. Let me see if I can draw it small enough. Right there, okay, the last check comes through the system. We had the PPP loans, the direct stimulus checks, the additional unemployment benefits. It added $4 trillion of more spending power to the consumers. At the same time, we were down in workers. And during that time period, as we got into late 2021, people said, you know what, I kind of miss the trips. I miss seeing people. And as things started to open back up, you'll notice service activity accelerates. Good has flatlined. But as services accelerated, as the cruise lines filled up, as the airports filled up, the rental car centers, the hotels filled up, as small and medium-sized businesses, I'm sure you saw it here in downtown Naperville, as they got back to activity, they have been noting one major issue for the last 24 months, 24 consecutive months, as they get asked, they do surveys, what has been their number one issue with getting activity back up and running? Finding qualified workers. They said they left. They left. We lost them when we couldn't be open. We lost when we kind of manipulated the economy towards what we could do. And all the workers went over there. And now we have a problem because we can't get them back. Now, there's a couple slides. They're not in your books. I'll get them over. We'll get them distributed. I thought about this afterwards. I'm looking at this, and you'd look at the good side of the economy, and I would think to myself, if they've been flat, very little movement over the past year and a half, 2 years, why aren't we seeing them start to let some of the employees go? They overhired. Why aren't we seeing more shifts back to the service sector? And here's where the Fed has a problem, because the Fed is in direct competition with the Congress. Right? The Fed's job is to get inflation back down to 2%. Congress's job is to get reelected, right? So these two groups have had this issue because over this time period, despite the fact that goods have been flat, we haven't seen the activity, right? We've seen a massive upswing in goods spending on construction. Does that make sense? Over the last 18 months, we've seen almost no increase in purchases. We've seen almost no increase in demand. Their activities have been stagnating, but yet they've doubled, more than doubled, over $100 billion more in construction spending to expand facilities, build new facilities. Why does that happen? Well, it's because we had the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. And Congress said, look, we'll give you funds. We will subsidize this activity. We will give you cheaper loans. What we want you to do is build the activity. We want you to bring services. We want you to bring things here to the United States. And so these good companies, despite the fact that they don't have activity for some of these workers right now, and we see it in the data. As the data comes out and we see how many jobs were added per month, one of the stats that often gets overlooked is that, well, we have more people working, they're working fewer hours. But these goods companies are looking at this and saying, we're going to have activity coming online over the next year or two. We are not going to let our workers go. So if you are the service-based companies, goods companies have an incentive to hold who they have. The issue they're having on the inflation side, right, is that you can't find enough workers and we can't bring enough, okay, into the labor market. Who is the single largest demographic we have today? The baby boomers. What is the average age of a baby boomer right now? 65. What are the baby boomers doing right now? Okay. And what are they doing that's been impacting the labor market over the last few years and will continue for the next 5 to 10? They're retiring. So we have this conflux of factors. We've got this issue where the workers are misallocated. They're not where we need them to be. We've got this issue where there's spending activity coming out of Washington, incentivizing us to spend, to build, to hire workers for an area that doesn't currently have the demand. And we have a demographic headwind. What this has ultimately resulted in is this pressure on inflation where we are turning over. We are seeing improvements in inflation, but it was not solved by the good spending, which is really where they thought it was going to be. It's now here on the service side. It's on the wage side. And I'm sure if you've turned on the TV, you've seen this year, right? We had 3 big labor disputes. First off, we had the UPS workers this year. They got their labor dispute settled. The UPS drivers are making, I think it's $170,000 a year. Second group that went through was the pilots, right? Pilots went through and said, well, yeah, we need new contracts too. They got the wages. What's the one that's been in the news lately? The auto workers. Now, the United Auto Workers said, look, we don't have much in demands. We want a 40% pay increase. We want our hours work dropped from 38 to 32, and we want the return of full pension benefits. And the company's like, I have no idea how we're going to afford this, but we can't afford to lose you. And so what we've seen is a lot of those negotiations and a lot of that coming through. We've seen this upward pressure on services. It may be peaking out because consumers are starting to say, you know what, things are getting a little tighter and it's a little more expensive to borrow, and maybe we're going to kind of turn. So this is it is starting to improve, but it's not an overnight fix. I believe that as we continue this process of reallocating the workers, getting them back into position, the Fed is probably going to have to keep rates higher through much of next year. Inflation by the end of next year should be close to 2%. Getting down towards where they need to be. They can start cutting during the second half of this next year. But as they do that next year, we're still going to see mortgage rates higher, car rates higher than where they've been over the last decade. Now, what does that mean for the groups? We start thinking about consumers, businesses. Because if you turn on CNBC, I did this the other day. I woke up, turned on CNBC, right? And the first thing they said is consumer debt's at all-time record highs. I'm like, well, that is a true statement. And they said, with consumer debt at all-time record highs, we need to be concerned because if the Fed keeps rates higher, we could be in for another go-around like we saw during the financial crisis. And I said, okay, you're wrong there. Let's dive into the details. This is what drives me nuts when I turn on CNBC. A report comes out this morning. Producer prices come out. I wrote from up in Wheaton this morning, and then I drove down. Somehow it takes me, as an economist full-time, it takes me 40 minutes to analyze all the data and write up a report. CNBC does it in 10 seconds, right? And they're like, we know the answers. They read the first sentence of the report and they didn't dive any deeper, right? So when I look at something like this on consumer debt, it's not just that consumer debt's at all-time record highs. You have to understand what's been driving this. If you look through it, the number one driver has been mortgages. Probably not a surprise for most people. Now people go and say, well, it was also the driver back here. So again, we see similarities, except these two situations are very different. The major drive in mortgage debt outstanding came in 2020 and in 2021. What happened during those 2 years? What happened to 30-year mortgage rates in 2020 and in 2021? They fell all the way to below 3%. Now, when you bought your first home, could you have imagined you would ever see sub 3% 30-year mortgage rates? Right, and here we stood. So not only was new borrowers, people coming out and saying, oh, COVID's here, I need a little bit more space. Maybe I don't need to because now we're working remote. I don't need to be in downtown. I don't need to be in XYZ state. I'm moving. Not only did that see some people move, buy new houses, but we saw a lot of refinancing. A lot of people took their single largest monthly obligation and they lowered their monthly payment. Now, why this is so different from back here in this time period is over here, okay, 95% of the loans during this time period were fixed rate loans. They locked in that cost, and mortgage rates may be 8% today, 7.5%, 8%, but it doesn't impact those who refinanced or got that 3%. They're going to pay that month in and month out until that loan is done. If we go back here, Okay, 45% of the loans that took place in 04, 05, 06, about 45% of the total loans outstanding by 2007 were adjustable rate. So as the Fed was raising rates, it was impacting consumers month in and month out. Right now, consumers are actually in a much better position. They're actually paying less in monthly payments for more debt outstanding because they've refinanced at lower and lower rates. Now, what that does mean for the housing market, who wants to sell their home right now? Nobody. Nobody wants to sell and get rid of their 3% 30-year mortgage to take on something at 7.5 to 8. We've seen this before. If you go look back at history, 78 to 81 looks very, very similar. Housing sales flatlined. Home prices didn't see a massive drop-off. Housing activity flatlined until rates started to come back down, and then we got back to what we do. Now we go through, there's other categories. There's home equity lines of credit, and then you get into things like autos. This one definitely makes the news. Why? Because defaults here are above pre-COVID levels. Why are defaults rising? Because if you remember, again, let's go back to 2020. Remember this period when used cars were selling for more than new cars? Right? And money was cheap. The average monthly payment on a vehicle in the United States right now, the average monthly payment on the outstanding auto loans is about $750 a month. That is a big number. Now, again, some of what we did down here freed up cash that allowed it to go in that space, but this, some people they got out over their skis. They did a little bit too much. This is one of those areas that you'll see there's going to be a little movement in this space. Is it enough to take down the consumer? No. And people say, okay, well, maybe autos are running into problems, but that's not the only thing. I saw in the Wall Street Journal the other day that credit card debt has hit all-time highs. And that is also true. Now, we talked to the banks and said, okay, credit card debt, you're issuers, you see the payments on this thing. Are you worried about the credit card debt? We talked to Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citibank, and they said, well, here's the thing. Credit card debt outstanding is at record highs, but so is their cash in their bank accounts. And in fact, their capacity to pay these is better than it's been at any point in the last 10 to 15 years. They said, look, again, this one, credit cards we're not as worried about. Autos, we're starting to see some things. And then there's that one that just restarted. Student loans. We could have a whole half-hour, 40-minute discussion on student loans. Look at the rise in the debt outstanding in student loans. It is massive. The cost of a college education has risen about 6 times faster than inflation in the U.S. economy over the last 30, 40 years. Is that sustainable? I don't think so, right? But there's been this push to get people in to take those years, go to college. You still make more afterwards. There was a question, what was going to happen when student loans restarted? Because if you remember about a year and a half ago, out of Washington, they said, we're going to forgive your student loans, $10,000 per person. Now, when that came out, how many people said, oh, I'm not going to have to pay that back. I can afford a little more on my car. I can afford a little more. I can take that extra trip. We got to this year and the Supreme Court said, actually, no, you can't do that. Right? Congress has to pass if we're going to do the student loan forgiveness. You can't do that as a presidential action. Okay, the student loans just restarted. October was the first month in which those came back. So far, and it's very early data, these groups that have the loan balances said it's coming in just fine. People are finding a way. Now, what will people do? What you'll see with things like student loans, with the autos, now people are not going to let their homes go. People will fight tooth and nail to keep that 3% mortgage. But we may see some hiccups in this other space. What you're very likely to see is a little bit of pullback on travel, a little bit of a pullback in things like going out to eat, right? They tighten the belt buckle a little bit in order to try to address these. But here's the thing. Even when we take all of these together, this movement on the mortgage side, the freeing up of capital, has done something important. Here's the way I really think about it at the end of the day. What percentage of after-tax income, what percent of the money that clears into your bank account from your paycheck after all those other taxes, everything's been taken out, how much of that has to go back to pay for what we just talked about? House, car, credit card, student loan. What you'll see is that that percentage is now back to where it was pre-COVID, but it's among the lowest levels that we have seen in the last 40-something years, which is how long the Fed has been getting this data. We are well below where we were pre-COVID. The consumer, at the end of the day, today, is doing just fine. They've handled their finances relatively well. They learned important lessons when they needed to de-lever after the financial crisis. They didn't dig themselves back into that hole. But what about businesses? Because business debt is also at all-time record highs. You turn on the TV and you hear about this. Now, this chart is near and dear to my heart. Okay, because the last time that our team was on CNBC, the last time we'll probably ever be on CNBC, we got in a fight with the host over this chart. Now, it was right before, it's a little bit hard to see. You see this jump that took place at the very beginning of 2020. We got in a fight with them right before that. It was December of 2019. They said, again, we've got this COVID thing. It's showing up in China. It's showing up in Europe. If that shows up here and corporations have this much debt outstanding, are we in for another Great Depression? We said, well, hold on a second. Just like we just talked about with consumers, you have to look at two different sides of this equation. You can have something like mortgages where the debt is up, but our capacity to pay is there. We said, what do the assets look like? Do corporations have the resources to pay that? And the host was like, I don't know, but we're talking about this chart. And we said, but you have to look at both sides. So we got the numbers, we sent them the chart, and it looks like this. And they said, okay, the charts look pretty similar. If we look at them, you can see there's the run up around 2000, there's the run up around the financial crisis, and then it took off. These two look very similar. We said, put them on the same chart. And here's what you see is that, well, debt was up. Debt had risen far slower than assets. And that the health of these corporations, the net worth of these corporations was at all-time record highs going into COVID. And we said, look, if the Fed starts cutting rates in response, and that's what they would do if we have a recession, these companies are going to refinance, they're going to make it through. And they said, no. 2020 is going to just see the markets get absolutely demolished. So we said, here's what we ask of you. Have us back in 12 months. We expect that the markets will be up and we expect the default rates will be down. Have us back in 12 months and let's have this conversation again. 12 months later, we didn't get a call. Now, that's not to say there aren't any issues. Again, if I go back and I look at this chart with the debt, what happened immediately after that, you see that jump. There are corporations who got access because this is when cash was unbelievably cheap and it was readily available. During that time period, right, all of a sudden cash was in the system and companies got access. They borrowed for 3 to 5 years and they started these new projects, these new COVID world projects. They had a hard time making money in 2020, a hard time making money in 2021. And then when they realized that the new COVID world looked a lot like the pre-COVID world, they're having a hard time because that debt is starting to, you were going to hear about some companies. Now, it's not the Fortune 500 companies. It's not the big companies, but there are smaller companies out there who borrowed at 3% back there in 2020. And as the debt is coming due this year and next, that number has jumped from 3% to 9%. And they have to make this determination. Are we still viable at 9%? And so banks are looking at this and saying, we have some of these loans. What we're going to do is we're going to start tightening up on lending. We're going to start putting in higher standards. We're going to make you put a little bit more down on deposits. Even for the S&P 500 companies, it's going to cost you a little bit more. So what are companies doing today? They're starting to pull back a little bit on investment. The manufacturers are not, right? Because they're getting the money through the axe, but everybody else, virtually everybody else is saying we're starting to pull back a little bit. You will see kind of this is what I expect to see in the year ahead is that consumers are going to be okay, but they're going to slow their spending a little bit. Businesses are going to be okay, but they're going to slow their spending a little bit. Economic activity hits this lull period as we get things in check and we deal with these higher rates. Who managed their finances the worst over the last 2-3 years? Washington. We just finished fiscal year 2023. Their year runs October 1 through the end of September. Okay, it's not a calendar year. This is why, if you remember back at the beginning of October, they were talking, are we going to see a government shutdown because we didn't have a new budget agreement? They kicked the can down the road. We're about to have that conversation again. In 2023, our deficit, how much more we spent than we took in all of our revenues, was over $2 trillion. Over $2 trillion, about 6.5% of GDP, more than we've ever seen outside of an active war environment or a deep recession. And we were in neither one of those. We also last year, by the way, had the unemployment rate below 4%. And we spent massively, at the same time it was costing us more and more to take on that debt. They've loaded the shelves. And here's the thing, is it going to change much this year? Are you expecting to see a big pullback in government spending as we're in an election year? No. They said, well, we could pull back in some areas. We got things like defense. Really? You're going to pull back on defense when we've got Russia and Ukraine, China in the South China Sea, and now the Israel-Gaza conflict. No, it's not going to happen. This number is going to see pressure. So right now, we're loading up the shelves once again with debt. And people said, well, how are we going to solve this thing? You want to know how we're going to solve it? The same way we did after World War II. How are we going to solve it? The same way we did after the 1970s. We have to control spending. You have to control spending. And then we slowly pay it down. We grow, we innovate. We've got the entrepreneurs, the risk takers, and there's no better place for them to operate than here in the United States. And it will take time. In the 1970s, what we saw was a political shift. People got fed up with what was happening right here. They voted, and we saw about a 16-year time period where Republicans and Democrats focused on the budget to the point where Clinton ran a surplus. And then we had the dot-com bubble, and we had 9/11, and we had the financial crisis. Now that we benefited from having low rates, so we added a lot of debt, and now we're dealing with the consequences. In the short term, this can lead to a slowdown, but does it impact our third thing? I'll tell you, if we see a recession, and it's a possibility in 2024, if we see a recession, it's going to be one of the shallowest recessions we've ever seen. Next year is a bit of a pause period. And then we get questions from people, well, if there's going to be a pause and we've added all this debt and consumers have more debt and businesses have more debt, if we're thinking about things like investment, what drives it forward? Why should our companies be worth more in 3 years and 5 years and 10 years? And this is my favorite part. Let me end with a couple slides on why I'm very excited about where we are today. Okay, and in order to do that, I thought, man, how can I display the progress, the innovation, the entrepreneurship that's happening? And I thought, next week is Thanksgiving. What's the day after Thanksgiving? Let's go shopping. So guess what? I brought you an ad to look at. Now you'll notice this is not, okay, it's not the current ad. This is an ad from 1999. But there are some unbelievable deals on here. If you look, it's a little bit hard to see. If you look down here, we have a 3-pack of VHS tapes. They are $6.99, but they come in with a mail-in rebate of $6.99. So these things are free. You've got this Kodak camera film. 99 cents, but they limited to 3 per customer because everybody wanted to have their film to document the holidays, right? You had this $3.99 color viewfinder camcorder. And oh man, look at it. We had a 5-disc CD changer. 5 discs. You didn't have to get up anymore to change your music. Sit back, you're decorating for the holidays, just hit the switch CD button. But what were the 2 big items? Yeah, it wasn't the $2 off the CDs. It wasn't the Frosty the Snowman VHSs. The 2 things everybody was excited about were, okay, this $249.99 color television, a 25-inch tube TV for only $249.99. And it came with picture-in-picture. Why did we get rid of picture-in-picture? I kind of like that one. That was one of the big items, but the single biggest item was this one. Because this is 1999, the internet revolution is upon us. Now, similar conversations to what we hear with AI today, right? Well, this may cause us to lose jobs. This may change the way we operate, right? This is a complete shift in how we work, how we operate, how we live, what we do, what we consume. And people were engaged. People were very excited in what the computer was bringing about. If you waited in line and you were one of those who was able to get this machine, check out these specs. It had 16 megabytes of memory. It had 2.1 gigabytes of hard drive space. It had a 14-inch tube monitor. And if you picked up one of these bad boys over here, a modem, you get 56K internet. As long as nobody picked up the phone while you were on it. Now, that's not it. That's not it. You also, as you can see, you got these 2 speakers, right? You got this printer, and you got this super cool sticker. Turn your computer off before midnight. We have no idea what's going to happen. You remember Y2K? How many people were in Naperville for Y2K? Were you downtown that night? Did you come down here for midnight? Do you remember the ball drop? It's funny. I've told this story to people. I'm like, I was in downtown Naperville, Illinois, sitting there. We had our own mini version of the ball drop. And as that ball was dropping, it's like 10, 9, 8. And we're like, what's going to happen? Are the lights going to turn off? Is my VCR going to start blinking midnight and that tape I picked up from Blockbuster is going to stop working? Right? And we went 3, 2, 1. Nothing. Now, you want to know what's wild? You all have this experience, right? Everybody's freaking out. Everybody's nervous. We hit midnight. Nothing happened. Think about this for a minute. Okay, I was telling somebody this. I was in Detroit a couple weeks ago, And then I thought, wait a second. I asked them, were you in Detroit for Y2K? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, so you're an hour ahead of us. You had experienced all this an hour before. How come nobody from the East Coast called us? Right? You think about it and you're like, how in the world did we not? Because that couldn't happen today. Now we're sitting here walking around with the phones in our pockets and all this. But you think, okay, so we had this Y2K and we had no idea maybe that computer was going to be a nice paperweight. Let's compare it to where we are today. Here's what you can get now. Okay, you'll notice no VHS tapes, no Kodak film, no 5-disc CD changer, no camcorder. Though I could argue you have all of those in this device right here. And in fact, they're better quality. For way less price, you get better pictures, better video, more storage. Not 5-disc. You can stream hundreds of thousands, if not millions of artists directly to your phone wherever you're at. Right? Technology has changed. What about those two big items? Well, we do have, again, a $249.99 TV. A $249.99 TV, and it's not a 25-inch tube television. This is a 65-inch 4K ultra high definition smart Android TV. Now you think, okay, well, that's cool, I guess, right? We have a bigger TV, we have a better picture, the movies come to us. That's interesting, that's entertainment. What does that tell us about progress? Can you buy a 25-inch TV today? I don't even know if they still make 25-inch TVs. Back in 1999, they didn't even have a flat panel on there. You could buy them. If you wanted to buy a 32-inch flat panel, then it was about $3,000. And they were plasma screens, and if you left them on too long, the picture burnt in. How much is a 32-inch flat panel today? Oh, it's way under 200. You can actually buy them for, especially if you do it, the Black Friday shopping, you get for about $50. That's wild. For $50, 1/5 the price, with inflation, you can get a better product. Why does that matter? Because we have unlocked these technologies to the rest of the world. Our devices that were the luxury items 20 years before COVID are now commonplace items in developing emerging markets, including that cell phone. And we'll come back to that in a minute. We have seen immense progress that doesn't just benefit us, it's made the world available to others. And then we've got this computer. I couldn't find a $999. This is the closest I could get, $799.99. Now, what are the specs on this? It's not 16 megabytes of memory. It's got 12 gig. Not 2.1 gigabytes of storage. It's 512 gigabytes of solid state. Not a 14-inch tube monitor. It's a 15-inch monitor built in. And you don't need to buy the modem because this has Wi-Fi. And that is where it gets exciting. That 56K internet you had, it transferred data at 0.00668 megabytes per second. I ran this morning. Okay, what was my connection? My download speed was 635.97 megabytes, which means today we are processing data just over 95,000 times faster. What data are we transferring? We're uploading videos, we're uploading textbooks, we're uploading the genome sequences. Think about this. In the year 1999, if you had a leaky faucet at your house, what did you do? Call the plumber. If you have a leaky faucet today, what do? You go on YouTube and there's 7 videos of your exact faucet model. And you're like, is it the drip, drip, drip pattern or is it the drip, drip, wait, drip pattern? Oh, that's the one I've got. That's interesting. It makes us a little more efficient. It means we can try to do more things, but don't lose sight of the fact that all of a sudden the rest of the world accesses this too. They are developing faster than we did, because we did the learning and now we've passed it along and we've made it more accessible. We've taken those devices, the smartphones that we carry around. There are more kids with cell phones in Bangladesh than kids that have electricity in their homes. Now, I studied this in Northwest. I'm like, why in the world was that? And I looked and we did some studies on it, okay? And we found out the reason was because they would take the phones, they would go to the train station. The train station had a bunch of power outlets and they had free Wi-Fi and the kids would go there and they'd get online and they would learn. And they had access to US institutions. MIT puts their classes online for free. Do you walk out with the MIT degree? No. But all of a sudden, these kids in Bangladesh have more access to information in their pockets than the President of the United States had 20 years ago. That is unbelievable. And then we've got this, and this is the last slide. Okay. Take this chart in for a minute. Global adult literacy. In 1963, for the first time ever in the history of this planet. In 1963, for the first time ever, more than half the world's adult population was literate. Now, how many people did we have on the earth in 1963? Just over 3 billion. We are closing in right now on 90% global adult literacy. How many people do we have on the planet today? We just surpassed 8 billion. We have more than twice as many people. We have more than twice as many people, and they can read and they can learn from those who came before them. We've got twice as many people who can learn from those who came before them, and they've got better access to information. They've got better access to sanitation. They're living longer because we have better health coverage. They're eating better. We now are averaging over 2,000 calories per day in sub-Saharan Africa. Think about what that means. When I went and I walked into my first macroeconomics class, they say economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. It's not. Economics is the study of the unleashing of human ingenuity, of human potential. If you want to look back at the history of economic growth, if you want to look back at the history of prosperity, it's been, driven by an unlocking of human potential. And we have more people today than ever before working on problems. We have more people today with better information and better education than we've ever had. As we go into Thanksgiving next week, as we go into the holiday season, you turn on the TV. I mean, have you had a single week that you can remember in your lifetime where you've turned on the TV and it's been good news? I don't think that's going to change. They know that advertising, they can sell a heck of a lot more ads if they drip negativity. But let's not lose sight of what's going on behind the scenes. The last thing I want to say is thank you. I've got a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old at home. They're growing up in this world. They're growing up with technologies that my parents, my grandparents could never have imagined. I'm growing up with things I never thought. And I'm able to do that because of the work that you've all done. The foundations that you've laid, the work you've done, each generation builds on the generation that came before them. Thank you for everything that you've done that has allowed me, my kids, and so many of us to grow up, to see the prosperity, to be a part of the most productive nation on the face of this earth. If we stop and pause and think about the progress that you drove, where we are today versus 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years, quite frankly, it's miraculous.